The morning sun peeked through the city's high-rise buildings, casting a soft glow over the manicured lawns and winding paths of Maplewood Park. It was the type of idyllic scene that only seemed to exist in carefully crafted neighborhoods where well-dressed dog walkers and joggers passed each other with polite nods, each absorbed in their routines. Among them was Katherine Reed, a woman who could effortlessly blend into the affluent crowd, but who also had a subtle way of standing out. In her late 40s, Katherine was the picture of elegance, her light blonde hair tied in a neat ponytail that swayed as she jogged, her designer athletic wear hugging her in all the right places. To a passerby, she was a woman in her prime, successful, well-connected, and always in control. Katherine prided herself on her morning routine in Maplewood Park. Every day she followed the same path, tracking her distance and time on the latest fitness watch. It was her way of keeping herself sharp, disciplined qualities she believed set her apart. Her morning jog was sacred, a time to clear her mind and mentally prepare for the day ahead, whether it was filled with charity luncheons, board meetings, or, as she liked to think of it, image maintenance. For Katherine, appearances were everything, and she worked meticulously to craft an image that aligned with the values she outwardly promoted. To those who knew her in her social circles, Katherine was a well-known benefactor. She chaired fundraisers, attended gala events, and was the face of several high-profile charity initiatives. One of her most beloved causes was a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting education for underprivileged youth. The charity had gained a prominent position in the city, and Katherine took immense pride in her role as one of its key supporters. She believed in the cause, or at least she liked the way supporting it made her feel about herself. In fact, her charitable involvement had become a badge of honor, an indication to the world that she wasn't just wealthy, she was compassionate and concerned about the well-being of others. As Katherine reached the halfway point of her jog, her mind drifted to the upcoming charity gala, just a few days away. She mentally ticked off the details she'd been overseeing for weeks. The seating chart, the guest list, the caterer, everything had to be perfect. After all, she wasn't just any attendee, she was the one who would be giving the opening speech, setting the tone for the night. It was a privilege and a responsibility she took seriously. To Katherine, this event wasn't just about raising money, it was a performance, an opportunity to shine in front of the city's elite, to reaffirm her position as a model of grace and generosity. Lost in thought, Katherine almost missed the figure sitting on a park bench a few yards off the main path. Slowing her pace, she glanced over, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than it should have. The man on the bench appeared to be black, casually dressed in jeans and a worn hoodie, with a large bag beside him. He was alone, sitting quietly with his hands in his lap, looking down at the ground as if lost in thought. Katherine's thoughts ground to a halt, disrupted by a strange feeling of unease. She didn't recognize this man. Maplewood Park was a familiar place. It had a predictable rhythm and a regular crowd. This man didn't look like he belonged to that crowd. She caught herself and mentally chided herself for thinking that way, but the feeling didn't entirely dissipate. Katherine had worked hard to avoid these kinds of snap judgments. She prided herself on being open-minded. But even as she tried to rationalize her feelings, a voice in the back of her mind whispered that something was off. Her instinct was to ignore it, but the longer she looked, the more her discomfort grew. There was something about the way he sat there, so still and introspective, that unsettled her. He didn't look like he was causing trouble, but he also didn't look like the usual joggers, dog walkers, or mothers with strollers who frequented the park at this hour. Katherine's thoughts began to spiral, questions she couldn't fully articulate buzzing in her mind. Was he waiting for someone? Why was he alone in a park that was usually bustling with activity? Shaking her head, Katherine tried to brush it off as paranoia. She didn't want to be the type of person who saw danger where there was none, but the unease gnawed at her, refusing to let her go. As Katherine resumed her jog, she took out her phone and glanced at it under the guise of checking her fitness app. She was debating whether or not to call someone, not 911, of course. It wasn't an emergency. Maybe she could call the local non-emergency line, just to have someone come by and take a look. After all, wasn't that the responsible thing to do? She didn't want to cause trouble, but she also didn't want to ignore her instincts. What if he was up to something? The thought planted itself firmly in her mind, growing until she could no longer ignore it. Katherine told herself it was for the community's safety, for everyone's peace of mind. It wasn't about race or prejudice. It was simply about her duty as a concerned citizen. protecting the park that had given her so much peace over the years. With a quick glance around to ensure no one was watching, Katherine dialed the non-emergency line. She kept her tone calm and polite, as though she were calling to report a lost dog or a suspicious package. She described the man on the bench, emphasizing that he hadn't actually done anything wrong but that he seemed out of place. She chose her words carefully, avoiding anything that might sound overtly accusatory. Her tone was measured, almost detached, as if to reassure herself that this wasn't personal, just a practical matter. As she ended the call, Katherine resumed her jog, her pulse quickening. She told herself that it was the exertion, the adrenaline from the workout, but deep down she knew it was more than that. A sense of anticipation coursed through her, mixed with a strange cocktail of fear and excitement. She felt vindicated, as if she'd taken a brave step in maintaining the harmony of her community. The minutes ticked by, and soon she heard the faint wail of a police siren in the distance. The sound sent a small thrill down her spine, a sensation she couldn't quite name. She didn't intend to stay and watch the police approach the man, but her curiosity got the better of her. Slowing down, Katherine made a show of checking her fitness watch as she glanced back in his direction. 2 officers were approaching the man, their hands resting on their belts, their faces a blend of professionalism and cautious concern. The man looked up at them, his expression one of surprise rather than guilt. From her vantage point, Katherine couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the officers exchange a few words with him, their postures relaxed but alert. To her surprise, the man didn't appear agitated or defensive. He nodded as they spoke, his expression calm and composed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look around for an escape route. Instead, he reached into his bag slowly, producing a few documents, and handed them to the officers. Katherine squinted, trying to make out what was happening. She felt a prickle of frustration. This wasn't going the way she'd imagined it would. One of the officers examined the documents and then exchanged a look with his partner. They both seemed to relax a little, their stances less rigid. They handed the documents back to the man, who nodded, offering a faint smile as he spoke. Katherine felt her frustration deepen, though she couldn't say why. She told herself that she should feel relieved that the man was evidently not a threat. And yet, the interaction left her with a sense of dissatisfaction, as though she'd anticipated a different outcome. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. Glancing down, she saw a message from the charity's director, reminding her of a conference call scheduled for that afternoon. Katherine took a deep breath, adjusting her ponytail as she forced herself to focus. She had more important things to worry about than a stranger in the park. But as she resumed her jog, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man on the bench, and the strange mix of emotions that his presence had stirred in her. Katherine tried to push the incident from her mind as she continued her jog. Yet, with each step, the sense of unease only seemed to deepen. She kept telling herself that she had done the right thing, acting as a responsible citizen. But in the silence of the park, a new feeling crept in, something sharper, harder to ignore. It was as though she had pried open a door to a part of herself she wasn't ready to confront. By the time she looped back toward the entrance of the park, she noticed the man from the bench was gone, though a police cruiser remained parked by the path. The officers appeared to be wrapping up their patrol, chatting quietly as they leaned against the car. Katherine debated whether she should approach them. She felt a strange need for reassurance, a desire for validation that her decision to call them had been correct. Unable to resist, she jogged up to the cruiser, her breath quickening from a mix of exercise and anticipation. One of the officers, noticing her approach, nodded politely. "Morning, Mom," he said with a courteous smile. "Good morning," Officer Katherine replied, feigning a casual tone. "I just wanted to check in. I was the one who called earlier about the man on the bench. I just thought he looked out of place." She tried to smile, but it felt forced. The officer's expression shifted slightly, as if weighing his response. "Yes, Ma, I am. We spoke to him. Everything's fine. Turns out he's actually pretty well known around here, maybe not to everyone, but to those involved in certain local charities." He nodded, as though to reassure her that there was nothing to worry about. Katherine blinked, caught off guard. "A charity," she repeated, a note of incredulity slipping into her voice. "Yes," the officer replied. "Apparently he runs a program that works with underprivileged communities. Seems like he was just here for a bit of fresh air before his next meeting." He paused, studying her reaction with a hint of curiosity. Quite an impressive guy, actually. He's been doing a lot of good work in the city. Katherine felt her cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and confusion bubbling beneath her composure. "Oh, I didn't know," she stammered, momentarily lost for words. She attempted to hide her discomfort, but it was clear the officer had noticed. "Not a problem, I am. You were just looking out for the community. That's what we're here for too," he said, his voice measured and professional. But Katherine detected a hint of judgment in his tone, subtle but unmistakable. His words, though polite, carried an edge that made her feel suddenly small. She muttered a quick thank you, already backing away, feeling exposed under the officer's steady gaze. As she walked briskly toward the park exit, her mind raced. She hadn't expected this outcome, a man quietly working to make a difference, while she'd immediately assumed the worst. The realization left her unsettled. Deep down, she'd always seen herself as an advocate for fairness and equality. After all, wasn't she known in her circles for her philanthropic spirit? She championed causes, donated generously, and aligned herself with organizations that claimed to uplift the underserved. But now, her reaction, the snap judgment she'd made, cast her in a starkly different light. She walked faster, her earlier satisfaction replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. The image of the man, calm and composed as the officers questioned him, replayed in her mind. Had she misjudged him because of his race? The question made her heart pound, though she desperately tried to dismiss it. But the thought wouldn't leave. As she exited the park, Katherine's mind swirled with a sense of dissonance, her actions at odds with the image of herself she'd always upheld. She wondered if anyone else had noticed her watching the scene unfold, if they, too, had seen her call the police and made assumptions about her intentions. The very thought made her stomach twist. Yet somewhere inside her, she felt a reluctant awareness stirring, one that dared her to face the uncomfortable truth she'd been trying to evade. The day had started like any other for Marcus Bennett, though he had felt a little more drained than usual. Running a nonprofit was rewarding but exhausting work, and there were times when the challenges felt overwhelming. Today, he'd come to the park for a brief respite, a chance to breathe, reflect, and gather his thoughts before his next meeting. The park had always been a peaceful retreat for him, a space to think about the future of Citybridge, the charity he'd built from the ground up to support educational programs for disadvantaged youth. Sitting on the park bench, Marcus let his gaze drift across the landscape, the greenery of the park contrasting sharply with the bustling city just beyond. He liked this spot. It was where he often came to refocus when the demands of his work felt particularly heavy. As he took a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs, he spotted a woman jogging in the distance. Her gaze seemed to linger on him, and Marcus could sense her eyes narrowing as if she were appraising him. It wasn't the first time he had felt this type of scrutiny, and he was well acquainted with the look of guarded suspicion. He'd encountered it in coffee shops, department stores, and boardrooms. People rarely saw past the surface, especially when his presence didn't align with their narrow expectations. But this time, the feeling nagged at him a bit more than usual. He tried to ignore it, but moments later, a police car pulled up along the path nearby, and Marcus's stomach sank. The officers stepped out of the car and began walking toward him. Marcus felt his muscles tense instinctively, his thoughts flashing back to his childhood, when he had been taught to keep his hands visible, move slowly, and never make sudden movements around officers. His parents' words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the quiet vigilance that had followed him through life. "Just do what they say, don't resist, and it'll be okay," they used to tell him, though he knew there were no guarantees. "Morning, sir," one of the officers greeted him, his tone polite but firm. "Do you mind if we ask you a few questions?" Marcus managed a nod, his voice calm. "Of course, officers. Is there a problem?" The officers exchanged a glance, one of them eyeing the bag at his side. "We received a call about someone sitting on a bench near the main path, looking out of place. Would that be you?" The question stung, though Marcus kept his expression neutral. He was used to these coded phrases, the vague language that people used when they wanted to voice their suspicions without sounding overtly accusatory. He kept his voice steady, reminding himself that he had nothing to hide. "I'm just here for a break before my next meeting," he explained, gesturing to the bag at his side. "It's a work bag." The officer nodded, glancing at the bag again. "Mind if we see some ID?" Marcus felt a pang of frustration. but he suppressed it, reaching into his pocket slowly and handing over his driver's license. He noticed one of the officers watching his every movement, his hand drifting a little closer to the radio on his shoulder. The officer examined Marcus's ID, his eyes flicking between the license and Marcus's face, as though verifying his identity wasn't quite enough. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Bennett?" the officer asked. "I run a nonprofit," Marcus replied. "Citybridge. We work with kids from under-resourced neighborhoods, helping them gain access to educational programs and support services." The officers glanced at each other, their expressions softening just slightly, though they still seemed on edge. Citybridge, one of them repeated, recognition dawning on his face. "Isn't that the charity that's been organizing those youth mentorship events downtown?" Marcus nodded, relieved that the officer had heard of his work. "Yes, that's us." The officer handed back his ID, his posture relaxing slightly. "I've heard about that. You all do some good work for the kids around here." Marcus forced a smile. Though the interaction had left him feeling drained, he wished he could take pride in the officer's recognition, but he knew it wasn't that simple. The only thing that had de-escalated this encounter was his job title, a stroke of luck that allowed him to sidestep the harsher realities that many faced without such privileges. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, taking his ID back. He wanted to end the conversation there, to walk away and return to his peaceful morning, but the officer continued. "We had a call from a concerned citizen. She thought you looked. Well, she just wasn't sure what you were doing here. Figured we should come check it out." The officer's words hung in the air, and Marcus felt a familiar anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. The concerned citizen, he could easily picture her in his mind. She would be someone who saw herself as caring, as civic-minded, but who couldn't look past his appearance long enough to see his humanity. It was the same type of person he'd encountered so many times before, people who wore their good intentions like armor but who acted out of fear rather than understanding. "Thank you for checking in, officers," Marcus replied, his tone even but distant. He gathered his bag and stood, ready to leave this scene behind him. But as he turned away, he couldn't shake the heavy feeling in his chest, a sense of weariness that went beyond the morning's events. As he walked, Marcus's mind drifted to the young people he worked with. They faced challenges every day, navigating a world that often refused to see them for who they were. In many ways, he saw himself in them, the boy who'd grown up on the rougher side of town, who had to fight his way through life and prove himself over and over again. He'd founded Citybridge to create opportunities for kids like him, to give them a chance to rise above the assumptions that others made about them. But today's encounter had reminded him of just how difficult it was to overcome those barriers, even as an adult. Marcus found himself wondering what would happen if one of the kids he mentored had been in his place this morning. Would they have had the same outcome, or would the police encounter have ended differently with harsher words and fewer explanations? Arriving at his next meeting, Marcus took a moment to compose himself. He straightened his shirt, took a deep breath, and entered the conference room with the calm, confident demeanor he had worked so hard to cultivate. The meeting was with potential donors, people whose support would allow Citybridge to expand its programs to reach even more young people. This wasn't just a meeting, it was an opportunity to grow his mission, to make a tangible impact. The meeting began smoothly, with Marcus presenting Citybridge's latest achievements and discussing plans for future projects. As he spoke, he felt the passion for his work rise within him, momentarily overshadowing the frustration from earlier. This was what he lived for, to inspire others to invest in a cause that could change lives. One of the donors, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, leaned forward, looking impressed. "Mr. Bennett, your work is truly inspiring," she said. "It's rare to see someone with such dedication to these communities. It must take a toll on you personally." Marcus gave a polite nod. "Thank you. It's challenging, but I believe it's worth every sacrifice." As the meeting continued, Marcus caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass wall of the conference room. There he was, dressed in his professional attire, presenting himself with calm confidence. But in that moment, he felt the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him, as though the encounter in the park had etched a shadow across his face. At the end of the meeting, as the donors filed out, the woman who had praised his dedication lingered behind, her eyes fixed on him with a look he couldn't quite decipher. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, offering it to him with a smile. "If you ever need support for a specific project, feel free to reach out," she said. I admire your resilience, Mr. Bennett. He took the card, murmuring his thanks, though her words echoed uncomfortably in his mind. Resilience. It was a word people often used to describe individuals who had endured hardship, who had overcome obstacles placed in their path by others. And while he was grateful for her support, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that she, too, saw him as someone to be admired for rising above, rather than as an equal who simply deserved the same respect. As he left the building, Marcus resolved to keep moving forward. The park incident would not define him. He had spent too long proving himself, too long building a legacy for Citybridge, to let one encounter chip away at his resolve. And yet he knew that these moments, these quiet reminders of prejudice, were as much a part of his reality as the successes he celebrated. Walking back toward his car, he noticed a notification on his phone, an email from the city's community events coordinator, inviting him to an upcoming charity gala. He recognized the name on the invitation: Katherine Reed, a well-known figure in the city's philanthropic circles and a longtime supporter of Citybridge. It struck him as ironic, almost poetic. If the woman in the park had been Katherine, would she have acted the same way? He felt a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. For all her good intentions, he wondered if she would ever see him as anything more than a symbol of resilience, a success story to be paraded at charity events. The hours after her encounter with the police officers had been a blur for Katherine. Though she had moved on with her day's agenda, something about the morning's events lingered, settling uneasily in her mind. She attended her meetings, confirmed catering arrangements for the upcoming gala, and spent time on the phone finalizing donation pledges, all tasks she'd typically relish as part of her role as a respected community benefactor. But today, her enthusiasm was dulled, clouded by an uncomfortable sense of disquiet. It wasn't until the afternoon, while reviewing the guest list for the gala, that her assistant, Lily, brought up an update that hit Katherine like a lightning bolt. "We're lucky to have Marcus Bennett attending this year," Lily said with a small smile. "I just got confirmation that he'll be available to attend after all. You know, the kids he works with absolutely adore him." Katherine's eyes widened, and she struggled to keep her expression neutral. "Marcus Bennett." "Yes," Lily continued, not noticing Katherine's reaction. "He's the founder of Citybridge. Remember? He's done incredible work for education in the city's underserved areas. You've been a big supporter of his programs." The realization washed over Katherine with a sudden, almost dizzying clarity. The man she had reported in the park, she was nearly certain it had been him. The police officer's words replayed in her mind. Apparently he runs a program that works with underprivileged communities. Her stomach churned as her assumption crystallized into shame. Throughout her career in philanthropy, Katherine had prided herself on her open-mindedness, on her supposed empathy and desire to uplift the less fortunate. But today, all of that felt hollow. If she were truly the advocate she thought herself to be, wouldn't she have at least paused to consider that the man she had suspected might be someone like Marcus, someone committed to bettering the world around him? The truth hurt, cutting deep and leaving her with a bitterness she struggled to swallow. Katherine forced herself to respond to Lily with composure. "Oh yes, Marcus. Of course," she replied, fighting to keep her voice even. "I'm glad he'll be there." But as soon as Lily left the room, Katherine's defenses crumbled. She closed her office door and sank into her chair, replaying the morning's events over and over. The reality of her actions clashed violently with the image she had built of herself, the caring philanthropist, the advocate for equality, the woman who was above petty biases. She remembered the look on Marcus's face as the officers approached him, calm and poised, meeting them with dignity despite her baseless suspicions. A new thought struck her, one that made her cheeks burn. What if he had recognized her? She was, after all, a familiar face at city events. And if he hadn't then, he certainly would at the gala. The thought of facing him, of him knowing what she had done, terrified her. Worse still was the realization that she didn't deserve to feel sorry for herself. Any embarrassment she felt was nothing compared to the indignity she had inflicted on him. For the first time, Katherine found herself questioning her motivations. Was her philanthropy about genuine care, or was it just a way to feel good about herself, to present a curated version of herself to the world? The unsettling truth was that she'd built her image on the backs of people like Marcus, yet when she'd encountered him outside the carefully controlled setting of a gala or a meeting, she had defaulted to the worst assumptions. The thought haunted her as she packed up her things and left the office, deciding she needed air. She walked aimlessly through the streets, her heels clicking against the pavement as she tried to make sense of the conflicting emotions swirling inside her. The pride she'd always felt in her work was now tainted with self-doubt, her polished image beginning to crumble as she examined it through a harsher lens. With each step, the weight of her actions grew heavier. She knew there would be no simple apology that could undo what she had done. An apology might make her feel better, might allow her to absolve herself of guilt, but it wouldn't change the fact that she judged a man she admired without a second thought. And it certainly wouldn't undo the countless times she'd likely done the same to others without realizing it. For the first time in her life, Katherine felt a genuine desire to do more than just donate a check or attend a fundraiser. She wanted to change not just her outward actions, but the very way she saw the world. The following day, Katherine's world unraveled faster than she'd thought possible. It began with a notification on her phone, a local news article detailing a recent police incident in Maplewood Park. She clicked on the link, her heart pounding as she read the headline. Community leader mistakenly targeted in park incident, Citybridge's founder faces unwarranted police scrutiny. Katherine's stomach dropped as she skimmed the article, which reported that Marcus Bennett, founder of Citybridge, had been stopped by police in response to a concerned citizen's report of a suspicious man sitting on a park bench. The piece did not name her, but the details felt pointed, like a thinly veiled accusation aimed directly at her. Though the article didn't confirm her identity, Katherine feared it was only a matter of time before people started piecing things together. The prospect terrified her. The backlash on social media was swift. Katherine watched as comments flooded in beneath the article, anger and disbelief mounting with each post. People expressed outrage, denouncing the incident as an example of racial profiling and questioning how someone as respected as Marcus Bennett could be treated with such suspicion in his own city. Several commenters noted the irony of the situation, calling out the concerned citizen for her prejudice and hypocrisy. One comment stung more than the rest. This person probably thinks she's helping the community when, in reality, she's part of the problem. Katherine closed her phone, feeling as though the walls were closing in on her. She had always been in control of her reputation, curating every detail to present herself as a force for good. Now her carefully constructed image was crumbling, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a way she'd never experienced before. As the day progressed, she received calls from several colleagues and friends, some expressing confusion, others asking if she knew more about the incident. Each question felt like a trap, as though they suspected her involvement but wanted confirmation. She could feel the weight of judgment in their voices, a subtle shift from admiration to skepticism. By the time she arrived at her office, Katherine was physically and emotionally drained. She tried to bury herself in work, hoping to distract herself from the shame and anger swirling within her. But the constant reminders, news updates, emails, even overheard whispers in the office were impossible to escape. Her assistant, Lily, knocked on her door around midday, her expression hesitant. "Katherine, I wanted to check in. I saw the article. I know you're a supporter of Citybridge. I'm sure this must feel personal to you given your connection with Marcus." Katherine swallowed, nodding stiffly. "Yes, it's deeply unfortunate. Marcus didn't deserve that." Lily's gaze lingered, a hint of sympathy softening her expression. Sometimes these situations can show us things about ourselves and others that we didn't want to see. It must be hard for Marcus, but maybe it's a wake-up call for all of us. The words struck Katherine with unexpected force, as though Lily had somehow read her private struggle. She nodded, forcing a smile as she thanked Lily for her concern, but her assistant's words continued to echo in her mind long after she left the office. Alone, Katherine faced the truth she had been avoiding. The public outcry and her colleagues' reactions were consequences she could neither ignore nor control. Her life had been built on a foundation of well-meaning actions and public displays of charity, but now she couldn't deny that her motivations had been, at least in part, self-serving. She'd cared more about how she was perceived than about the people she claimed to be helping. Katherine's phone buzzed with a notification, a reminder that she would be seeing Marcus at the gala in just 2 days. The thought sent a shiver of dread through her. She couldn't bear the idea of facing him, knowing the harm she'd caused. And yet she knew that avoiding him would only reinforce her hypocrisy. Taking a deep breath, Katherine resolved to go to the gala, and if she could summon the courage, to speak to Marcus directly. She needed to confront him, not only to apologize but to acknowledge the prejudice that had lurked in her heart and tainted her actions. The night of the gala arrived, and Katherine stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the clasp of a delicate pearl necklace. Her reflection seemed unfamiliar, the woman in the mirror more fragile than the poised figure she'd projected for so long. A part of her wanted to stay home, to avoid facing the shame she knew awaited her, but she understood that avoidance was no longer an option. She would go to the gala, and she would confront Marcus Bennett. It was the least she could do. The venue was elegantly decorated, with glittering chandeliers casting a warm glow over the spacious hall. Guests arrived in clusters, the soft murmur of conversation blending with the gentle strains of a string quartet. Katherine took a steadying breath as she stepped inside, greeting familiar faces with polite smiles that felt like thin disguises. She sensed curious eyes on her, subtle looks of judgment or suspicion. Though no one said anything outright, she could feel the quiet scrutiny surrounding her. Moving through the crowd, Katherine scanned the room until her gaze fell upon Marcus. He was speaking with a group of donors, his calm demeanor and warm smile making him the center of attention. He wore a simple but elegant suit, carrying himself with the same quiet confidence she'd seen in the park. She hesitated, feeling a surge of apprehension, but she knew she had to go through with this. Katherine waited until he finished his conversation, then approached him with a small, nervous smile. Marcus looked up, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face, though he quickly masked it with polite professionalism. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "I'm glad you could make it tonight." "Thank you, Katherine," Marcus replied, his tone courteous but distant. "It's always an honor to support Citybridge's mission." Katherine swallowed, her palms damp with nerves. She could tell by his restrained expression that he remembered her from the park, and that he was waiting to see what she had to say. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Marcus, I owe you an apology," she began, the words catching in her throat. "For what happened at the park. It was wrong of me to make assumptions about you, and it was even worse that I acted on them. I can't imagine how I made you feel, but I am truly deeply sorry." Marcus's expression remained unreadable, though he nodded slightly. "I appreciate your words, Katherine. But I have to ask, why did you do it? Why call the police when I was just sitting there, minding my own business?" Katherine felt the weight of his questions settle over her, pressing down on her carefully constructed self-image. She forced herself to answer honestly, even though the truth felt like a confession of her deepest flaws. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I was scared, or maybe I was just uncomfortable. I saw you there, and you didn't fit into the version of Maplewood Park I'm used to seeing. I know how awful that sounds, but I think that's the truth. I acted on an instinct that I hadn't questioned, and I'm ashamed of it." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I appreciate your honesty. But do you understand why that instinct is so harmful, Katherine? I face those kinds of reactions all the time. I've spent my life working to change people's perceptions, but encounters like that remind me of how much work there still is to do." His words were calm, yet they carried a depth of frustration and pain that Katherine could barely comprehend. She wanted to say something to ease the tension, to make things right, but she knew that words alone couldn't undo the harm she'd caused. All she could do was listen, to try and understand the impact of her actions. "I know my apology doesn't change what happened," she said quietly. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to changing, not just for appearances but in a way that matters. This experience has forced me to confront things about myself that I didn't want to see. I've spent so much time trying to look like a good person. But maybe I haven't been one in the ways that really count." For a moment, Marcus's expression softened, a hint of compassion breaking through his guarded exterior. He seemed to consider her words, weighing them with the wisdom of someone who had navigated a lifetime of similar interactions. After a pause, he nodded. "Katherine, I don't think people are defined by a single moment or a single mistake. But growth requires more than words. It's about action, about changing how you show up in the world. If you're serious about this, it'll take more than one apology. It'll take a commitment to understanding and addressing the biases that led to that moment." His words felt like both a challenge and an invitation, offering her a path toward redemption, but without any shortcuts. Katherine nodded, feeling a flicker of resolve settle within her. She realized that this journey would be a long and uncomfortable one, but it was a journey she needed to undertake, not for appearances but for her own sense of integrity. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly. "I want to do better, and I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to put in the work." Marcus offered her a small, genuine smile, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I hope you do, Katherine. I really do." As the conversation wound down, Katherine felt a strange sense of closure, not relief, but the weight of an unresolved journey just beginning. She knew that her life would be different from this point forward, that she could no longer rely on the hollow comfort of good intentions without real action. She would need to confront her own assumptions, to dismantle the prejudices she had allowed to go unchecked for so long. They parted with a handshake, one that felt both formal and deeply personal. Katherine watched as Marcus returned to the crowd, resuming his conversations with other guests. She felt a pang of regret for the barrier her actions had placed between them, but she understood that rebuilding trust would take time and patience, if it was even possible. Later that evening, as Katherine stood near the exit, she caught a final glimpse of Marcus across the room. He was laughing with a group of supporters, his warmth and dedication to Citybridge evident in every interaction. Katherine felt a mix of admiration and humility as she watched him, realizing how much she still had to learn from people like him, people who faced the world with courage, grace, and resilience in the face of prejudice. Walking out of the gala, Katherine felt the cool night air against her skin, a quiet reminder of the long journey that lay ahead. She knew she couldn't erase her mistakes, but she could choose to grow from them. And for the first time in her life, Katherine felt a true desire to do so, not for the applause of others, but for the quiet, unassuming work of becoming a better person.